everyone from London. Many of you follow me on LinkedIn and subscribe to the newsletter I put together for Simpliflying anyway, where I talk about testing on pretty much a daily basis, and that will be what I'll be running you through today. So I have a few slides, and certainly afterwards feel free to ping me any questions or comments. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the idea of testing plus. So not just testing, but how testing combined with a whole range of measures could kickstart aviation and reopen borders. So just to take a step back, I mean, obviously at the moment with the pandemic, we've got two different audiences and there's two different priorities and two different sets of messages. You first of all have the traveling public, and the message there is we don't want to get infected while flying. But then you have the authorities and the wider non-traveling public, which is we don't want infected people flying, and we don't want infectious cases to be coming into our country and causing COVID to spike again and mixing with the local population. Now, with the first message, aviation's actually done very, very well. You know, the various industry bodies, I mean, that section on the left comes from IATA. I've got the picture there of Delta, which obviously recently introduced hand sanitizers in its aircraft, a diagram from Air Canada. Really just about every single major airline has introduced effective biosafety measures to provide that extra level of reassurance. And obviously everyone will be aware of the debate that's happening, and particularly in North America, about whether the middle seat should be sold, and whether there's even such a thing as social distancing on aircraft. But with the second message, that's still a problem. And the problem, of course, is that infectious people are still flying, and they're still mixing with the local population. And I've just got a few examples here from August. You know, China banned Etihad and Sri Lankan for a certain amount of time when quite a large number of people on one and two flights tested positive. Finland directly tightened up their quarantine rules after a Wizz Air flight from Northern Macedonia brought in 23 COVID positive passengers, obviously again a huge number. And in Germany very recently, when the German government changed its testing regime, the Robert Koch Institute estimated that around 4 in 10 cases were imported. Clearly not all of them came by air, but some of them will have done. So if that's the case, and if governments want to stop travel having COVID from spreading, then what are they doing? And there's a range of measures we've had it here from the most to least disruptive. And in a lot of cases, these measures are being combined. So for example, if you take Australia has a partial travel restrictions with hotel quarantine. Australia has a cap on the number of people who can arrive at any one time because of quarantine capacity. And then they have hotel quarantine centers. Countries like Canada and the UK have got home quarantine. A number of countries introduced testing. And the least disruptive is obviously, which is now pretty standard, which is a system of passenger screening and temperature checks. But the thing is that short of completely sealing your borders, there's actually no way to 100% stop COVID from spreading. Now I've got some examples up here from Australia and New Zealand, which do use hotel quarantine. And I think the cases in Australia about the hotel quarantine regime not being perfect is quite well known. I mean, the current lockdown in Melbourne and Victoria is directly related to fairly lax standards at quarantine hotels and staff mixing with guests. But even in New Zealand, where the standards are much higher and there's much tighter procedures, a worker did recently test positive for COVID as a result of being at the quarantine hotel, and that was completely unrelated to the separate outbreak in Auckland. Then, of course, you have the problem with home quarantine, which is even more porous. You could have someone flying into an airport, traveling in public transport, traveling on a train, mixing with thousands of people before getting home. And then, of course, it's a question of, how well home quarantine is enforced anyway. So that really comes us back down to testing. And testing is the only solution now that will really kickstart aviation and travel before a vaccine comes around. And a question that I'm asked all the time is, how effective is testing really? And fortunately, we do have some research that was done by academics from the University of Hawaii, which are putting together recommendations for the Hawaiian Islands to introduce a testing before travel regime, where people will be tested less than 72 hours before departure, plus temperature checks. And they reckoned that this would stop 90% of infected travelers from the US mainland and from other destinations from reaching the Hawaiian Islands. Interestingly enough, temperature checks on their own would only stop 32%. The research from the University of Hawaii used statistics from Taiwan that showed that only about 1 in 3 are stopped by temperature checks. Obviously, temperature checks on their own are fairly ineffective. They can be used as like a final check or a final gate to stop people getting through. What about the other 10%? Well, the researchers thought the other 10% could be mitigated through just standard biosafety measures, so mask wearing and so on and so forth within the islands, and that would reduce the risk of a spread. But why is there this 10% gap in the first place? Well, first of all, there's the problem with tests. The best tests that are around will not show a result immediately. I mean, if I were to catch the virus today and I got a test tomorrow, it'd be very unlikely to show up. I mean, I spoke to the makers of Frankt from the Polish biotech firm GeneMe, and they told me that they do have about a 97% accuracy rate, but it picks it up after about 2 or 3 days. No test is, of course, 100% effective. I mean, even the best ones, you have a very small percentage where it doesn't pick it up. And then, of course, you have the differences in accuracy between the molecular tests and the neoantigen tests, where accuracy is even lower, of course, so it's much faster. Most testing for travel rules allow you to sort of to have a test taken 72 to 96 hours before departure. But of course, the problem is the longer the window, the greater the chance someone will be infected when they actually fly. Hence our suggestion, Testing Plus, is sort of to try and close that last 10%, for as much as possible, even by a few percentage points. And that would involve a range of measures with testing at the core. So you would have, first of all, pre-screening travel authorizations, a test before travel, not on arrival, that's cheap, accessible, and done 24 hours before departure or at departure. So you really shrink the window. Selective testing on arrival, possibly after 5 days, if you come from certain high-risk countries. Biosafety measures that exist at the moment. Track and trace for 2 weeks. And then importantly, some kind of central industry register of approved tests and standards that are applied across the board. To go through each of those travel authorizations, I mean, a good example is, a number of countries do this. I've got the example of Jamaica up there. If you want to travel to Jamaica, I mean, Jamaica has different testing and quarantine rules for different types of travelers, but essentially the first step is you have to apply for this ESTA type form. If you come from a low-risk country, you get the result back within a day. If you come from a high-risk country, then about 2 or 3 days, you also upload a test certificate. Apparently an algorithm is used. So that's quite a good example of how pre-travel screenings and pre-travel authorizations can be done. And of course, if you do this, then you know who's coming into the country, and that makes track and trace much more effective when visitors are actually in your destination. Mentioned testing on departure rather than testing on arrival, and this is a quote from that University of Hawaii report that I've mentioned, where basically they advocate testing on departure rather than arrival for, really for a number of reasons. And one of the key things is that if you test on arrival, then the onus of quarantine and on dealing with the infected passenger is on the destination. Is on the place where you arrive, which places a burden on the healthcare system. Also, by testing on departure, you add in a high degree of a certain degree of certainty for staff and for passengers, and you even have the capacity to make, let's say, terminals to make them into into clean zones and safe zones where everyone, whether they're a passenger or whether they're a member of staff, has been tested. Those tests, as we say, really they should be done not 72 hours but 24 hours before departure or at departure. The greater the time taken, the less accurate it's going to be. Obviously, those tests have to be accurate and validated by a credible third party. There's a certain amount of skepticism around about the testing regime because of a lot of magic tests that were doing the rounds in March and April that simply didn't work. Clearly, it has to be cost effective. Charging someone 150 or 200 euros for a PCR test is not credible, especially if they're traveling with a family. So the cost has to be brought down, have to be fast, under an hour, ideally under 30 minutes, easy to implement, so can be done by trained staff, not necessarily medical staff, accessible. So either do it just before you get to the airport or within high street pharmacies or drugstores. 2 examples of that is British Airways is reportedly going to cooperate with the Boots chain of pharmacies in the UK to offer testing. And Delta is offering staff testing with the CVS chain of pharmacies in the US. And obviously the results have to be transmitted, they have to be electronically secure, they have to be validated. Now, what about the cost? The cost could be offset with vouchers. And this is something the Canary Islands are examining, whether you can offer tourism and travel vouchers at the destination for the value of the actual test. Of course, the benefit is that money then goes back into the local economy. Then in addition to testing on departure, we advocate a selective test on arrival. A number of countries does this. The United Arab Emirates does this, and then the UAE you have to provide a test certificate on departure, and then certain categories of traveller are then tested again. The Channel Island of Jersey between England and France has a system that I think works. They have a three-tier test system. Test on arrival or departure for everyone when they come into the islands. Then if you come from amber countries, so medium risk countries, you have to do a 5-day quarantine and then a second test afterwards, at which point you are potentially allowed to go free. And then for red countries, there's simply a test and 14-day quarantine. That's potentially a smarter system than, for example, if we take Iceland, where they do have a 2-stage test process where you test on stage 1, on day 1 and on day 5, and then go. You could also have random tests on arrival based on passenger screening when they arrive. Think a little bit, it could work the way that customs checks do. Obviously, track and trace is very important. I've used the example of Jersey again. That's a fairly rudimentary system, but it works. You leave your details, you receive an automated email or text messages for 14 days after you arrive. You simply have to reply with the word "well" to the SMS message confirming that you have no symptoms. Then, of course, there's more sophisticated systems for you. For example, I have to download an app. I've got the Dubai app there on the right. Biosafety and screening has to remain in place. I mentioned the fact that temperature checks are about 1/3 effective. The infrastructure is already there, obviously, at airports. On its own, this won't work, but it could be a sort of a step that you make passengers go through just to sort of to weed out, an extra few more percentages. But for all this to happen, I mean, it's very important that we probably cannot count on governments. And this quote comes from Britain's Health Minister, Matt Hancock. And in the UK at the moment, there's a very active campaign spearheaded by a number of newspapers to persuade the government to replace blanket quarantines with testing. And there's a lot of pushback from government ministers about this, who I think quite honestly see it as a drain on resources with our testing capacity not being great in the first place, and are very much against the idea. And here's this quote from Matt Hancock where he says, "I've heard stories of people saying, I'm going on holiday, I'm going on a flight, I'm going to get a test to see if I'm okay." And he says, that's not acceptable. So, we have to be realistic that in a lot of places, governments will not take the initiative in making this happen. And the blunt instrument of travel bans and quarantines, it's simply easier and much simpler to administer and to implement. So the way forward is really for airports and airlines to take the initiative and to start proof of concept trials. And we have a number of those taking place. We have ones taking place in Toronto. We have ones taking place at London Heathrow, where Heathrow has been trialing 3 of the newer, faster tests in existence. And then Vancouver and WestJet will be starting a test in the autumn for certain departing passengers. Have the results, lobby governments, show that it works. And then for a good example of what's actually possible is if we look at what I personally think is the most impressive airport and airline testing facility around, which is the one done between Frankfurt Airport, Lufthansa, and the German biotech firm Centogene. And over the summer, they've had a testing center at Frankfurt Airport. Lufthansa recently released results of this. As a result of that, testing capacity has been increased from 5,000 a day to a very impressive 10,000 a day. Now, the Frankfurt facility, the cost of the test is, it's not cheap, but it's reasonable. It's 59 euros for a standard test, albeit you have to wait for 8 hours for the results to get back. But what Centogene have actually done is they've actually placed a mobile lab within the grounds of Frankfurt Airport, which saves time and means the tests don't have to be sent off externally somewhere. Clearly, it should be backed up with an independent research to show that it's validated, to show that it works. I've used the example of Hawaii. And then finally, on a global level, I think it's quite important that industry bodies come together to create what could be almost like an approved registry. So, to have a minimum standard and which tests meet that standard in terms of accuracy and which tests have been validated. You also, of course, need some sort of system for test interoperability. that someone, for example, flying from London to Tokyo via Moscow doesn't have to be tested 3 times when he or in London, changing in Moscow and again in Tokyo, but that one test result can be communicated all the way through his or her journey and is interoperable and is accepted. Final point, it's not going to be the case that at some point next year that, let's say that on March the 1st, we'll be using testing, and on March the 2nd, we'll be using vaccines. There is going to be a time where testing and vaccines are going to work together side by side. Different populations, different countries are going to be vaccinated at different times. There will be different kinds of vaccines, obviously, in existence on a country-by-country basis. So testing and vaccines are going to have to work together for next year. And it's worth everyone in the industry thinking about what sort of regime that's going to involve and how that's going to work together. That's really it. Any questions, just get in touch. You can message me on LinkedIn or email me at dirk@simpliflying.com. Thank you for your time. And yes, I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards.